Harold Peterson had always been a man of routine. For 43 years, he'd risen at 6 a.m. sharp, brewed his coffee in the same chipped ceramic mug, and read the newspaper cover to cover before heading to his job at the Carson City post office. Even after retirement, he maintained that schedule, though now he spent his mornings tending to his small garden behind the modest ranch house he'd shared with his late wife, Margaret, for over 5 decades. But Alzheimer's disease doesn't respect routines. It steals them, one precious memory at a time, until even the most familiar becomes foreign territory. On a sweltering Tuesday morning in late August, something went wrong with Harold's internal compass. Instead of shuffling to his garden as he had for the past 3 years since Margaret's passing, the 78-year-old man found himself standing in his driveway, car keys in hand, with an overwhelming urge to visit Margaret at the hospital. In his confused state, he couldn't remember that she had died, couldn't recall that the nearest hospital was 30 miles away through some of the most unforgiving desert terrain in Nevada. His daughter, Susan Martinez, had installed safety locks and alarm systems throughout the house after Harold's diagnosis 2 years earlier. But she couldn't be there every moment, and Harold had retained enough of his old mechanical skills to defeat the simple door alarm that morning while she was grocery shopping. By the time she returned to find his bed empty and his 1995 Ford pickup truck missing from the garage, Harold had a 2-hour head start into the Nevada desert. The landscape that Harold drove into that morning was beautiful in its harshness, vast. Expanses of sagebrush and Joshua trees punctuated by red rock formations that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments. It was also completely merciless to anyone unprepared for its extremes. Daytime temperatures regularly soared above 110 degrees, while nighttime could bring bone-chilling cold. Water sources were few and far between, and the area was home to rattlesnakes, mountain lions, and other creatures that had learned to thrive in this austere environment. Harold's truck ran out of gas about 15 miles northeast of Carson City, on a dirt road that saw maybe 1 vehicle per week. By then, his Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where he couldn't remember why he was driving or where he was going. He simply got out of the truck, left the keys in the ignition, and began walking in the direction he thought looked most familiar, which was deeper into the desert. Meanwhile, Susan had called the Carson City Police Department and the Nevada State Highway Patrol. Search and rescue teams were assembled, helicopters were dispatched, and an Amber Alert-style Silver Alert was issued for missing seniors. But the Nevada desert spans over 100,000 square miles, and finding one elderly man in that vastness seemed nearly impossible. What the search teams didn't know was that Harold wouldn't be alone for long. The Calico Mountains Wild Horse Management Area is home to one of Nevada's most magnificent wild Mustang herds. These aren't the pampered horses of suburban stables. They're descendants of Spanish horses brought to America centuries ago, animals that have learned to survive in one of the continent's most challenging environments. The herd that would soon encounter Harold consisted of 12 horses, led by a powerful bay stallion named Sentinel by the local Bureau of Land Management rangers who monitored the herd. Sentinel was an impressive animal, standing nearly 16 hands high, with a dark, brown coat that gleamed like polished leather in the desert sun. At 13 years old, he was in his prime, possessing the perfect combination of strength, intelligence, and leadership that kept his family safe in an environment where a single mistake could mean death. His herd included 4 mares: Aurora, a palomino with a cream-colored coat; Sage, a gray mare who served as the herd's lookout; Whisper, a young black mare who was Sentinel's current favorite; and Dakota, an older chestnut mare who acted as the herd's unofficial babysitter for the foals. The herd also included 6 younger horses, 3 2-year-old colts who were beginning to challenge Sentinel's authority in small ways, 2 yearling fillies who stayed close to their mothers, and 1 foal born just that spring to Aurora. It was a tight-knit family unit that had survived droughts, severe winters, and the constant threat of predators through cooperation, vigilance, and an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. On that Tuesday afternoon, as Harold stumbled through the desert in his house slippers and pajamas, growing more confused and dehydrated with each step, Sage spotted him first. The gray mare had been grazing on a hillside about a quarter-mile away when she noticed the unusual figure moving erratically across the desert floor. Horses have evolved to be highly sensitive to anything that moves differently than it should. It's often the difference between life and death when mountain lions are hunting. Sage's alert call brought the entire herd to attention. Sentinel trotted to higher ground and observed the strange creature that was clearly not a coyote, not a deer, and not any other animal he recognized. The human was moving slowly, stopping frequently, and occasionally falling to his knees. Even from a distance, Sentinel could sense distress. Wild horses generally avoid human contact. They've learned through generations that humans often mean capture, separation from family, or worse. But there was something about Harold's condition that triggered a different response in the herd. Perhaps it was his obvious vulnerability, or maybe it was some deeper instinct that recognized a creature in desperate need of help. By late afternoon, Harold was in serious trouble. The desert heat had dehydrated him severely, and his confusion had worsened to the point where he was talking to Margaret as if she were walking beside him. He stumbled and fell in a small arroyo, scraping his arms on the rocky ground and tearing his thin pajama top. As he struggled to stand, he looked up to see 12 wild horses standing in a semicircle around him. In his confused state, Harold wasn't afraid. His failing memory had transported him back to his childhood on a ranch in Montana, where horses had been as much a part of daily life as sunrise and sunset. "Hello there, beauties," he said softly, extending his hand toward Sentinel. "Aren't you a handsome bunch?" What happened next defied everything that wildlife experts understood about wild horse behavior. Instead of bolting at the sound of human speech, Sentinel approached Harold slowly, lowering his great head to sniff the old man's outstretched hand. The stallion's dark eyes showed intelligence and something that almost looked like concern as he assessed Harold's condition. The other horses formed a protective circle around Harold and their leader. Dakota, the maternal chestnut mare, began nudging Harold gently, encouraging him to stand. When he struggled to his feet, swaying dangerously, Whisper positioned herself on his left side while Aurora took his right, creating a living support system that kept him upright. As the sun began to set and the desert temperature started its dramatic nighttime drop, the herd made a decision that would have astounded animal behaviorists. They surrounded Harold completely, using their large bodies to create a windbreak and share their warmth. Sentinel took the position closest to the direction from which predators were most likely to approach, while the mares arranged themselves to form a protective barrier around the confused old man. Harold, operating on childhood memories of horses, understood at some instinctive level that he was safe. He leaned against Aurora's warm flank and closed his eyes, while the Palomino mare stood motionless, serving as a living pillow for a creature she had no reason to help but every instinct to protect. Meanwhile, the search for Harold continued through the night. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment flew grid patterns over the desert, while ground teams checked every dirt road and hiking trail within a 50-mile radius of where his truck had been found. Susan had barely slept, coordinating with search and rescue teams while battling her own guilt over leaving her father alone that morning. "He could be anywhere," she told the search coordinator, Deputy Sheriff Mike Rodriguez. "When he gets confused, he thinks Mom is still alive, thinks he needs to get to her. He might not even remember his own name right now." Rodriguez had led dozens of desert searches over his 15-year career, and he knew the statistics. People Harold's age, especially those with dementia, rarely survived more than 24 hours in the Nevada desert without water and shelter. But he kept those grim numbers to himself as he organized additional search teams for the morning. What they didn't realize was that Harold was receiving better protection than any human rescue team could have provided. The Mustang herd possessed survival skills honed over generations of desert life. They knew where to find water in seemingly barren landscape, understood how to conserve energy during extreme heat, and maintained a vigilance that never faltered. As dawn broke on Harold's second day in the desert, Sage made a discovery that would prove crucial. The observant mare had located a small spring about 2 miles from where they'd spent the night, one of those hidden desert oases that exist in rock formations throughout Nevada. The water was clean and cool, fed by an underground source that had sustained wildlife for thousands of years. The challenge was getting Harold to the water source. He was weaker after his night in the desert, despite the horse's protection, and he was becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. He kept asking for Margaret, sometimes seeming to think one of the mares was his wife. Sentinel solved the problem with a strategy that demonstrated remarkable intelligence. The stallion positioned himself directly in front of Harold and began, walking very slowly toward the spring, stopping frequently to look back and ensure the old man was following. When Harold stumbled or seemed confused about the direction, Dakota would gently nudge him back on course, while Aurora and Whisper flanked him to prevent falls. The journey to the spring took nearly 2 hours, with frequent rest stops in whatever shade could be found. Harold's house slippers had long since fallen apart, leaving his feet cut and bleeding from the rocky terrain. But the horses seemed to understand his limitations, choosing the easiest possible route and maintaining a pace that wouldn't exhaust their fragile human companion. When they finally reached the spring, Harold collapsed beside the water and began drinking desperately. The horses watched nervously, knowing from their own experience that drinking too much water too quickly after severe dehydration could be dangerous. Sentinel actually used his large head to gently push Harold away from the water after a few minutes, forcing him to rest before drinking more. As Harold recovered beside the spring, the horses maintained their protective formation. The younger colts grazed nearby, but always within sight of the main group. The foal stayed close to Aurora, though it seemed fascinated by the strange creature its family had adopted. Even the most independent members of the herd, the 3 2-year-old males who were beginning to assert their own dominance, remained close enough to help if threats appeared. The spring was located in a small canyon that provided natural shelter from the worst of the desert heat. Harold dozed fitfully in the shade of a large boulder, while the horses took turns drinking and keeping watch. Their presence had transformed what should have been his death site into a temporary refuge. But the desert's dangers were far from over. Late on the second afternoon, Sage's sharp eyes spotted movement on the canyon rim above them. A mountain lion, drawn perhaps by the scent of the horses or the unusual activity around the spring, was stalking slowly along the rocky ledge, looking for an opportunity to attack. Mountain lions are one of the few predators capable of taking down an adult horse, and they're particularly dangerous to foals or injured animals. Harold, in his weakened condition, would have been easy prey, but Sentinel had spotted the predator at almost the same moment as Sage. The stallion's response was swift and decisive. He issued a series of sharp warning calls that brought every member of the herd to full alert. The mares immediately moved to shield Harold and the foal, while the younger males formed a second defensive line. Sentinel himself moved to the most exposed position, placing himself between the mountain lion and his adopted family. The confrontation lasted nearly an hour. The mountain lion, a large female probably hunting for her own cubs, made several attempts to find a vulnerable approach, but the horses maintained their formation flawlessly, presenting a united front that made any attack extremely risky. Sentinel reared up on his hind legs several times, his hooves flashing dangerously, while issuing the piercing calls that wild horses use to warn off predators. Harold, deep in an Alzheimer's fog, was only dimly aware of the drama unfolding around him. But some part of his mind understood that he was being protected, that these magnificent animals had chosen to risk their own safety for his survival. In one of his few moments of clarity during those 3 days, he reached out to pat Aurora's neck and whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart. Margaret always said horses were angels with hooves." Finally, the mountain lion gave up and disappeared back into the rocky terrain above the canyon. But the horses remained vigilant throughout the night, knowing that predators often return when they think their prey has relaxed its guard. By the third morning, Harold's condition had stabilized somewhat. The regular access to water and the protection from extreme temperature swings had prevented his situation from becoming immediately life-threatening. But he was still lost, still deeply confused, and still more than 20 miles from any human habitation. The search efforts had intensified dramatically. Susan had convinced the local news stations to run Harold's story, and volunteers had arrived from across Nevada to join the official search teams. The Nevada National Guard had contributed additional helicopters, and an expert tracker from the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe had been brought in to look for signs that the organized teams might have missed. It was this tracker, a 54-year-old man, named Joseph Running Bear, who first noticed the unusual horse tracks near Harold's abandoned pickup truck. Joseph had been tracking animals in the Nevada desert since childhood, and he immediately recognized that these weren't the random wanderings of wild horses moving between water sources. The tracks showed purpose, organization, and most puzzling of all, they seemed to be moving with something that wasn't a horse. "There's something different about this," Joseph told Deputy Rodriguez as they studied the tracks in the dusty soil. "These horses are moving like they're escorting something. See how they're bunched together? How they keep stopping and starting? That's not normal grazing movement or migration behavior." Joseph began following the trail with the methodical patience that had made him legendary among local law enforcement. The tracks told a story of the herd's movements over the past 3 days. The initial meeting point where Harold had first encountered the horses, the careful journey to the spring, the defensive formations they'd taken during the mountain lion encounter. "I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of tracking," Joseph said as the trail led them deeper into the desert. "It's like these horses have adopted something and are taking care of it." The revelation came when Joseph's trained eye spotted something that had been missed by all the previous search teams. A small piece of torn fabric caught on a sage brush, fabric that matched the description of Harold's pajamas. From that point, the trail became clearer, leading directly toward the hidden spring where Harold and his protectors had spent the last day and a half. As the rescue helicopter approached the canyon that morning, pilot Sarah Chen was prepared for the worst. Most desert rescue missions that lasted more than 48 hours were recovery operations, not rescues. But as she flew over the canyon rim, she saw something that made her radio back to base with excitement and disbelief. "Base, this is Search 1. I've got eyes on the missing person, and you're not going to believe this. He's surrounded by wild horses. Repeat, the subject appears to be alive and in the company of approximately 12 wild mustangs." The scene that Sarah observed from her helicopter defied easy explanation. Harold was sitting beside the spring, leaning against Aurora while she grazed nearby. The other horses were positioned around the canyon in what was clearly a protective formation. When the helicopter's noise echoed through the canyon, Sentinel reared up and called out what sounded almost like a challenge, while the mares moved closer to Harold. The ground rescue team, led by Deputy Rodriguez and including 2 EMTs, approached the canyon carefully. They were experienced in desert rescues, but none of them had ever attempted to extract someone from the middle of a wild horse herd. "We need to be extremely careful," Joseph Running Bear warned as they prepared their approach. "These horses have been protecting him for 3 days. They're going to see us as a threat to their family member." The actual rescue required patience and respect for the bonds that had formed between Harold and his equine protectors. Joseph approached slowly, speaking in low, calm tones while the EMTs prepared to assess Harold's condition. The horses watched suspiciously but didn't bolt, perhaps sensing that these humans meant no harm to their adopted charge. When Harold saw the rescue team approaching, his face showed confusion and something that looked almost like reluctance. In his Alzheimer's-affected mind, the horses had become his family, his protectors, his connection to safety in a world that no longer made sense. "It's okay, sir," EMT Janet Morrison said gently as she knelt beside Harold to check his vital signs. "We're here to help you get home." But Harold's response broke the hearts of everyone present. He reached out to pat Aurora's neck and said clearly, "I can't leave my friends. They've been taking care of me. Margaret always said we should be loyal to those who are loyal to us." The rescue team's medical assessment revealed that Harold was dehydrated and exhausted, with cuts and scrapes on his feet and arms, but he was in remarkably good condition for someone who had spent 3 days lost in the Nevada desert. His core body temperature was normal. He showed no signs of severe heat stroke, and while confused, he was alert and responsive. "This is miraculous," Janet told Deputy Rodriguez quietly. "By all rights, he should be in critical condition or worse. It's like something was regulating his body temperature, providing him with water, keeping him safe from predators." As the rescue team prepared to transport Harold to the ambulance waiting at the canyon's entrance, the horses remained close, clearly agitated by the prospect of losing their human family member. Sentinel paced back and forth, calling out repeatedly, while the mares clustered around Harold as if trying to prevent his departure. Joseph Running Bear, who had spent his life studying the behavior of desert animals, was deeply moved by what he witnessed. "I've tracked thousands of animals over the years," he said later. "I've seen pack behavior, herd behavior, territorial behavior, but I've never seen wild animals adopt a human being and care for him like family. This changes everything. We think we know about horse intelligence and empathy. The moment of separation was heartbreaking." As the EMTs prepared to carry Harold on a stretcher up the canyon wall, he became increasingly distressed, reaching back toward the horses and calling for his friends not to be left behind. Aurora followed the stretcher for as far as the terrain would allow, whinnying softly, as if trying to reassure Harold that he would be okay. Sentinel's farewell was particularly poignant. The great stallion approached the stretcher and gently nuzzled Harold's outstretched hand, as if understanding that this was goodbye. Then he lifted his head and issued a long, mournful call that echoed throughout the canyon, a sound that brought tears to the eyes of the hardened rescue workers. Harold's recovery at Carson City Hospital was swift and remarkably complete, considering his ordeal. Within 24 hours, his dehydration had been corrected, his minor injuries had been treated, and he was physically stable. But the experience had affected him in ways that puzzled his doctors and family. During his few lucid moments, Harold spoke constantly about his horses and insisted that they had saved his life. He described their protective behavior, their intelligence, their apparent understanding of his needs. When Susan gently tried to redirect his attention to other topics, Harold would become agitated and insist that people needed to understand how special these animals were. Dr. Amanda Foster, the neurologist treating Harold, was intrigued by his consistent recollection of the horses, even during periods when he couldn't remember his own daughter's name. "There's something about emotionally significant events that can sometimes cut through the confusion of Alzheimer's," she explained to Susan. "The fact that your father's memories of these horses remain so clear and consistent suggests they had a profound impact on him." The story of Harold's rescue made national news within days. The combination of a vulnerable elderly man, magnificent, wild horses, and an almost miraculous survival story captured the public imagination in ways that surprised everyone involved. Television crews arrived in Carson City to interview the rescue team. Wildlife experts weighed in on the unprecedented behavior of the Mustang herd, and animal lovers around the world shared the story on social media. But perhaps the most important impact of Harold's adventure was what it revealed about the intelligence and capacity for compassion in wild horses. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, an equine behaviorist from the University of Nevada, began studying the Calico Mountains herd specifically because of their interaction with Harold. "What we witnessed challenges our fundamental understanding of horse cognition and social behavior," Dr. Martinez explained in her subsequent research papers. "These horses made sophisticated decisions about care and protection for a creature that wasn't part of their species. They demonstrated planning, cooperation, and what can only be described as empathy on a level we've never documented in wild horses. The Bureau of Land Management, which manages wild horse populations throughout Nevada, also took notice. The Calico Mountains herd received special protection status, ensuring that they wouldn't be subject to the roundups that sometimes reduce wild horse populations in other areas. The spring where Harold had been protected was designated as a critical water source and was included in the herd's permanent territory. 3 months after his rescue, Harold's Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where he needed full-time care in a specialized facility. But his daughter Susan made sure that his room was filled with photographs and artwork depicting wild horses, especially mustangs. On his good days, Harold would still tell anyone who would listen about his friends who had saved his life in the desert. Susan also established the Harold Peterson Wild Horse Protection Fund, which provided resources for monitoring and protecting the Calico Mountains herd. She visited the canyon where her father had been rescued and left a plaque thanking Sentinel, Aurora, Dakota, Whisper, Sage, and the rest of the herd for their extraordinary compassion. Joseph Running Bear began offering special tracking tours that ended at the spring where Harold had been protected. He used these tours to educate visitors about desert survival, wild horse behavior, and the deep connections that can exist between humans and animals. The spring became known locally as Harold's Haven, and it remained a place where the Mustang herd could always find clean water and safety. The 3 young colts who had been part of Harold's protection detail grew into powerful stallions themselves, eventually starting their own herds in adjacent territories. But they retained the unusual tolerance for humans that they had learned during those 3 days with Harold, passing this trait on to their own offspring and gradually changing the character of wild horse-human interactions throughout the region. Sentinel continued leading his herd for several more years, his reputation as an unusually intelligent and compassionate stallion spreading throughout the horse community. Wildlife photographers and researchers came from around the world to observe the herd that had demonstrated such remarkable behavior. The stallion seemed to understand his special status, often posing majestically for cameras while maintaining his natural wariness and wild dignity. Aurora, the gentle palomino who had served as Harold's pillow and comfort during his desert ordeal, became something of a local celebrity. Visitors to the area would often spot her distinctive cream-colored coat and remember the story of how she had used her own body warmth to keep an elderly man alive through cold desert nights. She remained with Sentinel's herd for the rest of her life, continuing to demonstrate the maternal instincts that had made her Harold's primary caretaker. The spring that had provided life-saving water during Harold's ordeal became a symbol of hope and survival for the entire region. During drought years, when other water sources dried up, it continued flowing, supporting not only the Mustang herd, but countless other desert creatures. Local Native American elders said it had been blessed by the spirits of compassion that had guided the horses to protect Harold. Harold Peterson passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years after his desert adventure, with photographs of wild horses surrounding his bed and the sound of recorded horse calls playing softly in his room. According to his daughter, his last clear words were, "Tell my friends thank you for taking care of me." On the day of Harold's funeral, something extraordinary happened at the canyon where he had been rescued. Multiple witnesses reported that Sentinel and his herd gathered at the rim of the canyon and called out in unison, a haunting, beautiful sound that echoed across the desert for miles. It lasted for nearly 10 minutes, and then the horses disappeared into the vast Nevada landscape, as if they had somehow known that their human family member had completed his final journey. The story of Harold Peterson and the Calico Mountains. Mustang herd became part of Nevada folklore, but more importantly, it changed how people thought about the intelligence and emotional capacity of wild animals. It demonstrated that compassion doesn't recognize species boundaries, that protection and care can come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes, when humans are most vulnerable, the wild world responds with a kindness that defies all scientific explanation. Today, visitors to the Nevada desert can still see Sentinel's descendants running free across the sagebrush landscape. They carry with them the genetic legacy of horses, who understood that strength should protect vulnerability, that intelligence should serve compassion, and that family extends beyond the boundaries of species. In a world that often seems divided by differences, the story of Harold and his horse protectors reminds us that love and loyalty can bridge any gap, even the one between wild and human hearts.